Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. This is Mukulika Banerjee in London, joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari in Delhi. Today we are going to talk about India, poverty, RCTs, and inequality. To help us understand these key issues about India, we have perhaps the best person we could have had for this discussion, Professor Esther Duflo. Esther is an economist who has studied India during her career and has worked with several state governments on development policy. She's currently the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT. She's the joint winner, of course, of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019 with her co-authors and researchers, Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kramer, for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Duflo is the co-founder and co-director of JPAL, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, that promotes the use of RCTs in policy evaluation and boasts a network of nearly 1,000 researchers across 97 countries. Since 2024, Duflo is also the president of the Paris School of Economics. Welcome to the India Briefing, Esther.
Thank you.
Welcome, Esther, and thank you for making the time to speak with us. I suppose the first question I want to really ask you is, how did you find yourself in the field of economics? Did you, from the start, look at it as a potential tool for fighting poverty? And I wonder what the field of development economics was like when you came into it.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here. So it's actually I came to economics a bit as an accident. I was never really envisioned that I would be an economist. I was a little bit torn between a career in academia, in which case I would have been a historian, and a career in public policy, going towards the great administration schools that we have in France to prepare to be a career bureaucrat of some sort. And as I was trying to navigate this choice, I decided to take a year off and spent a year, not quite off, but away from my natural surroundings. And I went to Russia for a year. And in Russia, I got the opportunity to work for some economists and also to meet Thomas Piketty, who was then an economics professor at PSE, and to work very closely with, at MIT, and to work very closely with Daniel Cohen, who was a professor in Paris, very charismatic professor and author in Paris. All of these things convinced me that economics as an academic discipline allowed me in some sense to find a sweet spot between a career in academia while being useful in the public policy world. So that's how I became an economist. And when I was studying in France, economics was extraordinarily theoretical and also quite ideological, with a lot of ideological fights actually, but both sides being very ideological. And not very empirical and not very data-driven. And so before having gone to Russia, I had taken some economics already, but I found it deeply unsatisfying for this reason. But what Thomas Piketty told me at that time is, look, MIT will have a different approach. It's much more empirical. It's much more oriented on real topic. You will enjoy that, find it useful. And so when I arrived at MIT to start my PhD, I really arrived at the onset of a revolution, which is the field was changing. There was what has been now called the credibility revolution of trying to really change the way that we estimate the impact of public policy and programs, and therefore, much more interest also in empirical work and policy-oriented work. So I kind of arrived at the beginning of that. This is a movement that was taking place both as far as US policy is concerned and was only nascent in terms of development economics, and I was lucky to become part of it.
So Esther, your work has been overwhelmingly so much on poverty, and you've worked in India for over 2 decades. 20 decades still makes you
Oh, that
far
is a long
older
time,
than you are.
yes. I don't look it, do I?
No, well, you are the youngest Nobel Prize winning winner, so in economics. So now, in these 2 decades, how has the nature of poverty changed, would you say, both qualitatively and quantitatively?
So definitely there is a decline in the number of people, a dramatic decline in the last 2 or 3 decades in the number of people who live in extreme poverty, or the Indian poverty lines for a long time was about $1 a day at purchasing power parity, which was also turned out to be about the international poverty line. And then now it's the poverty line has gone up both internationally and in India. But regardless how you count it, there has been a decline in extreme poverty, um, and that's in fact responsible for a good bit of the decline in poverty in the world as a whole. So that's maybe the biggest change, which is worth highlighting. Of course, there remains a lot of residual extreme poverty, as well as people who just live in very vulnerable, uncomfortable lives. But one issue that we have now is that we don't really know how much poverty is left, because the data is not available anymore. And there is a very long tradition in India of collecting data on households' consumption, that in particular to calculate poverty level. In fact, India is one of the kind of pioneer, and some of the statisticians like Dr. Rao, well, it kind of revolutionized the field, not just for India but for the world. But in recent years, that data has become much less, collected in a somewhat more haphazard way, and also not released. So we have less of a specific sense of what's happening in recent years. But over the last 30 years, there is absolutely no doubt about a tremendous decline in extreme poverty.
So, Esther, we keep talking about the fact that India has grown exponentially as an economy. And it is one of the largest economies in the world today. But for a lot of people, perhaps it might be difficult to square this with the fact that we still have, to a large extent, rampant poverty. Poverty has declined, and we don't have enough data to know whether it's declined commensurate with the growth. But I wanted to get your sense on it, on the way in which growth, inequality, and poverty have been interacting in India, and what are the key lessons there.
So in a sense, it's just it's basic arithmetic, which is, if you take the pie and the pie has increased, no doubt about it, then the second question is, what share of the pie is taken by what group? And worldwide, not just in India, there has been an extraordinary increase in the share of the pie that is taken by the richest people, the richest 1%. And there has also been an increase in the share of the pie that's taken by the poorest people. So all of these things, these two facts combined, people have called the elephant curve of poverty, where the richest have become richer and richer, but the poorest of the poor is also becoming less poor, and that's kind of the great success in India. So this fact that the richest people are commanding a greater part of the overall pie, that has been the case in India. That we can document, for example, looking at tax returns data when this was released. Again, it's not released anymore, but it used to be released for a while. And Thomas Piketty and Banerjee have looked at this data and shown how the richest 1%, or 1/10 of 1%, etc., have gotten a larger and larger share of the pie. So when that happens, of course, it leaves less for everyone else, including the middle class and the extremely poor. So that's a first fact, is that the inequality basically leaves less for the rest to take advantage of this growth. I would say it's less bad in India than it has been in other places, for example, in the US, where basically almost all of the growth has been captured by the very richest people, leaving the median wage pretty much unchanged for everyone else. India is not like that. That's why there has been this decline in poverty. But still, there is that increase in inequality at the top, which has perhaps reduced the impact that economic growth could have had on poverty. Here I should say that one thing that is really worth noting is that, so we don't have the data now. We don't know what's happening to extreme poverty. I think the data exists and could be, it would be nice to get it again, even in aggregated form, but for the moment it's not there. So instead, what people have tried to do is to kind of estimate what might be the case. And one of these estimates, which is very prominent at the moment, was cited in a recent article in The Economist, for example, is basically to assume there is no change in inequality and therefore poverty has to have declined to zero. And I should say this is really important to say. We have no idea. This may be true, this may not be true, but it's clearly, you can't just assume it in the absence of looking at the data directly. And while it's hard to look at inequality because it's very hard to collect data on the very, very rich, looking at poverty is really not that difficult because it's not that difficult to collect data on the poorest. And so it would be something that should, in my opinion, could become a priority again of organizations like NSSO in order to inform public policy.
Mukulika was saying in her introduction, Esther, that so much of your work has been about poverty. And I'm sure interviewers like us ask you about poverty and its nature and its decline and so on endlessly. I wonder, what are some of the common misconceptions that people have about the poor and poverty?
So there are several, and again, that's not just an Indian phenomenon. This is something you're finding in every country. So anybody who is not poor will tend to assume many things about why the poor people are poor, and in particular, if possible, kind of blame it on them. So this is something that we also finding in India. So one of the misconception, which I think is kind of really predominant in many social programs, is the worry that including the wrong people in social protection is worse than excluding the wrong people. So it's not so much a misconception about poverty, but a misconception about how to fight it. And a lot of the social protection apparatus in India forever, this is not something recent at all, is based on this really terror that you might, inadvertently help the wrong person. And therefore you end up really missing a lot of the right people. I'll give you an example of that. It's a study that was done in Delhi, where the researcher interviewed women who might be eligible for widow's pension or disability pension of some form, and figure out whether they are getting it, and if they are not getting it, why, and try to get them to apply for the pension. And what she finds is that a lot of people don't even apply because they worry that they are not going to get it anyways. Even if they apply, they think that they will have to pay a bribe. They think that, and the truth is that there are very few bribes paid in the system. It's just a lot of zealousness in kicking people out, which needs to be counteracted by knowing the right person so that they can intervene on your behalf and so on. So people who actually need the most the help are the least able to access it. So that, I think, is a pretty big problem and misconception in the way that things are are constructed. Another one that we keep encountering in education system is that some version of poor children can't really learn, and then the explanations might vary. It could be, because their nutrition is not adequate, or it could be because their parents don't really care, or it could be because themselves are lazy, and that's why, that's a fundamental reason why the performance of the education system is low. And in fact, in my work, I found that poor children are perfectly able to learn, and the reason why the education system performance is low is because the pedagogy is to be redesigned. So that's another one that ultimately it's kind of the kids' fault in education. So I'll stop with these two.
Thank you very much for that, Esther. Now, your work has been synonymous, right, with randomized controlled trials, RCTs, as a tool for evidence-based policymaking. Right? Now, can you explain for our listeners how this approach was developed, how it's evolved, what its limitations are, what are the other approaches that you can contrast RCTs with? Do you rate them at all, or do you think RCTs really are the most reliable way of gathering evidence for policy?
Yes, of course. Let me maybe take 1 minute to summarize what RCT is, just so that we are not. So this stands for Randomized Controlled Trials, and that's really it's most well known in the medical field. So, for example, when you want to test a new vaccines, you will inoculate some people with the vaccine, and then some people will either receive the whole vaccine or no vaccine, a placebo, and then you check. You follow them for some time, and you see whether they get infected with the virus that you're targeting, whether they get sick, whether they die, and then you compare and you say whether your vaccine is effective or not. And this, of course, has revolutionized medicine in the 20th century by replacing intuition with evidence. In the social sector, in social policies, is something that was much less present 20 or 30 years ago when I started my career. But it can be done just the same, because in a lot of cases, especially when you start a new program, you have a pilot phase anyways. So it's the difference between doing this pilot phase in your backyard or choosing a more representative sample and then randomizing who gets or get not the new program in that phase. That's not necessarily, in fact, increasing. It's less about a new program versus an old program, but about a way of doing things that is different. So to give you an example, I've done a lot of work on immunization, and one of the concern is how to build a parents' demand for immunization. And you might be thinking, okay, we can try giving them small incentives, we can send them reminder messages, we can try to involve the community to relay the message. So those are three possible approaches, which could be done in combination or separately. And then we set up, to give you a very concrete example, with the government of Haryana, a large experiment where these different approaches were tried in different villages, which allows us to determine not only which one works, but what's the right dosage and what's the right combination of them, and therefore to come up with a policy recommendation. So here the question is less, should there be an immunization program or not? That's pretty obvious, but what's the best way to structure it in terms of getting the maximum effectiveness of the money and the resources that are deployed on the ground? So you were asking about how we developed support. So it's kind of happened maybe in two phases, I would say. There is a first phase, which in fact begins in India and in Kenya, more or less simultaneously, which is working with NGO champions who are sort of interested in measuring the impact of their own actions and get involved into individual programs. So in India, it's Pratham, but also Seva Mandir, in Rajasthan, who got kind of conducted the first program. And then as we got results, started to discuss them, the base of support increased first to other NGOs and then to governments. And sort of the second phase is getting support to governments, not just as a consumer of results, but also as producer of results by getting into a common project, collaborative project of evaluation of their policies. So, for example, we've been engaged in the partnership with the government of Tamil Nadu for years now, where it's literally every line department who comes up with what it is they're interested in, what they would like to innovate on, and then researchers helping them with designing the pilot. So that's kind of an example in which things have started. And then we've also done projects like that in Gujarat, in particular on environmental policy, very successfully, culminating into large-scale policy adoption. And in Haryana, I just mentioned, and basically all over the place now, we have this type of partnerships in dozens of states.
So you gave us a very good example of when you want to immunize people and you want to incentivize immunization, and you have a couple of ways to go. RCTs can help you study and find out what is the best way so that you can optimize the results and you can direct resources to the best possible outcome, towards the best possible outcome. But as somebody who has reported on ground on policy for many, many years and has also been a student of development policy, I found, as I'm sure you have, that there's always been some degree of resistance to looking for evidence when people feel like the answer is intuitive. So, to give you an example, if there is an outbreak of malaria, people are going to be like, policymakers are going to be like, why do we need to study how this can be helped? Just give people mosquito nets. But perhaps, even though it sounds intuitive, it might not result in lowering the instance of malaria. I'm taking this from a real life example from a paper that you might be familiar with, but I wanted to ask you to give us a couple more examples, or perhaps just one example, of what happens when policy is grounded in evidence and what happens even when a policy is well-meaning but not grounded in evidence. It'll be great if the example is from India, but can be from anywhere, really.
Yeah, so that's a great question, but I think we need to step back a little bit and think about what governments are doing. And in a lot of cases, governments are acting under some set of emergency. There are things that needs to be done and they need to be done quickly. And there you have to kind of proceed. You can't be studying all the time. So my contention is never that 100% of government policy should be producing evidence and not even evidence-based. My point is that there should always be a margin to produce evidence so that the toolbox of projects that have shown their effectiveness, or also the projects that have shown that they are not effective, increases, and then governments can use this toolbox as and when needed. You see what I mean? So in a sense, if a government say I have an outbreak of malaria, my best guess is we need to distribute bed nets, then be my guest and distribute bed nets. But I'm hoping that some government somewhere will say, well, if we are going to distribute bed nets, should we? A lot of questions that are, that I've been calling plumbing questions come up, which is, well, should we give them for free? Should we ask people to pay for them? Should we distribute them like very concentrated in a village so everyone has them, or should we spread them around? All of these questions, regardless on the importance of bed nets, which in a sense is proven from biomedical studies, might make the difference between a success and a failure. But sometimes you might just not have the time to study it and you have to move forward. But if one government somewhere has the time to study it, then the finding can be applied by others who need to move ahead. So I think that's kind of the way in which evidence is incorporated both in the production of policy new policies and in the use of, in the adoption of programs, is progressively increasing the toolbox. Let me give you examples of things that may, not so much what happens when you don't evaluate, but what happens when you evaluate. Sometimes you find that what seemed really obvious is kind of not, that doesn't actually work as much as you wanted. So it's a program that my colleagues Rima Hanna from Harvard Kennedy School and Iqbal Daliwal from JPAL implemented, and there was a lot of interest at the time in government in using technology to monitor government workers. And they put in place a sort of biometric measurement of health workers in health centers in Karnataka. And they were really excited about it. They evaluated this program, and basically they find that it had no impact at all. That quickly there was some arrangements that whoever was not there was paid anyways, and the machine were not always working, and for whatever reason it just didn't function. And I choose this example because it's a bit parallel with the excitement that there is today about using AI in governments everywhere, and it sounds like, oh, this is going to improve things, like for sure. But in fact, who knows? It may not. It depends. So at JPAL, in fact, we have an initiative called AI for Good now, where we are basically volunteering to say, well, let's try the use cases in practice. So that's an example of something that doesn't work. Let me give you an example of something that does work and has changed policy. And it brings us back to the poverty that you were talking about. We still have pockets of extreme poverty in India. People living under maybe $50 a day, and those are usually women who is either widows or whose husband has been incapacitated some way or the other. There's a program that was originally developed by BRAC, the organization in Bangladesh, which is now called the graduation program, where the idea is concentrating the resources on some people for a period of time, 15 to 18 months, with the hope that they'll graduate from poverty. So basically, people receive an asset, they receive a lot of support to take care of their asset originally. So in rural areas, it could be 2 cows, or it could be 4 goats, or enough to start a small shop, and then they receive help. So it's a very expensive program because of the assets, plus you multiply the price by 2 when trying to with all the wraparound support. But the theory of change is that that's worth it because you will then see the impact like forever, because the person will be permanently graduated out of poverty. So it's really essential to evaluate a program like that and to evaluate it over the long term, because otherwise the money is not worth spending. And evaluations were conducted in 7 countries, including in India, in West Bengal, and found really large impact after 15 months, after 3 years, after 10 years, and we now have results after 15 years. And it finds that the impact are positive. In fact, in our very more recent results, we still find really positive effect after 15 years. That's fresh off the press. So that evidence really was instrumental in convincing both individual states, like for example Bihar, to adopt it as part of their poverty to fight extreme poverty, and finally the entire country. The Ministry of Rural Development now kind of spreading this graduation approach across and supporting it across the entire countries. Without this evidence, I don't think it could have happened, because you would not, you would have no idea to know whether it's a good use of the money for this vexing problem, even if though, across governments, no matter what political color of the government, everyone cares deeply about this problem of extreme poverty, but they want to make sure that they're doing it in the most effective way possible. And so that's an example where it's kind of made a huge difference.
So just following up on that, Esther, I mean, what you've described is exactly what a welfare state would do, right? To get people out of poverty permanently, what you call the graduation program. Now, in the last 10 years or so, or over the period that you've been studying India, how do you see India's welfare state having evolved? What has changed? What has remained the same? Are there innovations? Are there some mistakes that are being repeated? How do you read it?
So one of the innovations is this extension of
Yeah.
the Chapeau program, which I think is extraordinarily positive. Another innovation that you're finding a little bit everywhere, and again, that's not. It's almost irrespective of the of which who is in government in every state, and that's more of a state subject than a central subject. Is the spread of direct benefit transfers, where people are given a cash transfers program, usually quite small and not necessarily in the most targeted way. Whether or not it's a mistake, I can't tell you because I haven't seen that many evaluation of the impact of those programs. But I would certainly like to see evaluations. I can see a rationale for these programs, sort of a form of ultra basic income that Arvind Subramanian pushed when he was a economic advisor, and it can help people fall into poverty traps and give them some amount of security. But on the other hand, the money is so small and so spread out, and some not necessarily ultra considered way, that I think it would be helpful to know what the impacts are of these schemes, and I haven't seen that many evaluations of them. So I can't tell you whether that's a good or a bad development, but it's certainly a development. I think it's a good idea to consolidate a lot of the zillions of schemes and in-kind programs into cash, because we are much better at distributing cash than lentils. So that I think is unambiguously a good thing. But often these little cash transfer are more spread on top of an existing structure with a gazillion programs. And in that case, I think it would be worth looking at what they're actually doing and whether they're not like kind of a drop in the bucket.
So actually, Esther, I'm going to push you a little on this because we did an entire episode, Mukulika and myself, on cash benefit transfers to women, which seems to have emerged as a very strong poll plank in India across party lines. Almost all the recent state elections, this has been a big factor in what people believe has led to victories or losses, which is quite significant to our mind. And like you said, I completely appreciate the fact that we don't have solid evidence on whether this works or not. But given that you've been studying the field of poverty alleviation in the field of poverty alleviation for so long, so many different schemes, I wonder what are the factors you think might be at play when it comes to the commitment of direct benefit transfer, cash transfers to women in particular, given the opportunity cost, because the figures are staggering. And when the Delhi elections were happening, the previous government's own in finance department didn't seem to think that it's sustainable, the kind of transfers that they were promising. So completely taking on board the fact that you don't have evidence to look at, what are the factors you'd ask policymakers to keep in mind, other than the one you already mentioned, that if it is not consolidated, if it is on the back of so many other schemes that are running, then the opportunity cost goes up further?
So I've made a long and productive career not to opine on things for which there was no data, so I'm not going to. I'm going to try to stick to that, but just a few points, and they are pulling in slightly different direction. One point is that for all we know, people who get cash transfers make good use of the money. So there is now a meta-analysis of about 70 different cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers around the world, and 130 different studies of those 72 programs, which was written by Dean Carlin and Chris Udry. And they tend to find positive impact of these programs across the board. So one worry that we shouldn't have is, oh, people are going to waste it. And, it's like a dollar is a dollar. People make good use of it. And so to the extent it goes to women who are in weaker positions, slightly maybe strengthen their hands, and then give them some cash on hand, I think why not? So that's on the sort of positive side. On the negative side, as you say, the issue is what else gives given limited budget constraint. And there are two ways of thinking about that. One is maybe there are more targeted cash transfers you could have. That would be make a bigger difference because the people needed more, assuming you are able to target. And I'll give you one example of that in the context of Tamil Nadu is pensions. There is an existing pension program. In fact, Tamil Nadu was one of the pioneers of pension program. There is an existing pension program for all people who do not have support from elsewhere. But that program is characterized by what I was describing before, which is kind of hard to get a hold of it because you have to prove that you really have no dependent that can take care of you and so on. And it's very small. It's just not quite enough for someone to live on. So I think a legitimate question in the context of Tamil Nadu is, at the same time they have one of those 1,000 rupee schemes that go to some people a little bit on top of whatever else they had. A legitimate question, and again I'm asking you the question is, well, should you have used that money to try and target the support to older citizens, make it easier for older citizens to get their pension, and to older citizens who don't have a private pension or a state pension, make sure that they get supported and that they have enough to live on the support, as opposed to this tiny amount added to family budget where probably it doesn't make a difference. So I think that's the question that's on my mind. I'll just leave it as a question more than as a policy recommendation, but it is worth thinking this through. Or conversely, you could say, I'm talking about old people, but you could say, well, let's focus on families with young children and make sure that the transfers are helping people take care of their kids, making sure they go to school, that they get all of their immunizations and so on, with which was kind of very much the idea behind conditional cash transfers in all over Latin America. And they don't have to be too strict conditionalities, but those type of programs have, focused on families, so, and maybe again a little bit larger, might stretch the money a little further. And then finally, you could have a sort of really bottom line social security, like the safety net income that people access when they have a shock, as opposed to getting it systematically. So these are things I think worth thinking about.
Yeah, in fact, this reminds me of, I'm an anthropologist, and the social anthropologist Akhil Gupta has a book called Red Tape on the Indian state. And he calls these eligibility criteria and putting the roadblocks to even qualifying to get any of these benefits as plain structural violence of the state. In fact, you make it so hard for people to get hold of the money that in the process, any benefit they may get is nullified. So what you're saying makes complete sense. Only clearly, what you're also indicating is that a lot more work needs to be done on evaluating how these are working out and how one can make it more targeted, but targeted in a way that doesn't raise opportunity costs for them. So following up on that, Esther, you've mentioned Tamil Nadu a few times. You've worked there for a very long time. Um, Tamil Nadu always stands out as a state in India that is doing a lot better than other states. There is, in fact, a very uneven pattern across the 29 states of India in terms of reducing and alleviating poverty. How do you explain that? What is the reason behind this inequality across Indian states?
So I think there really are like a number of factors that are at play. It's extraordinarily persistent with the southern states having sort of done better like
Yeah.
forever and continuing to do better and sort of pulling apart from the rest. So some of it probably dates back from colonial history and how the colonization was different, with more individual responsibility and autonomy, etc., in the southern state, and more like kind of direct control, leaving behind pretty bad social structure in the northern state. Some of it maybe perhaps as a result comes from the different level of human capital investments, where you have people in the south of India, Kerala, but not just Kerala, the entire south being more educated at all levels. More higher education, more keep kids going to school and learning to read and so on, than in the north, and then it kind of builds on each other. With the quality of opportunities and so on. Some of it comes from the caste structures and historical caste conflict, and some of it comes maybe from a combination of bad luck with sort of succession of not necessarily best governance in some of the northern states. But none of that, I mean, it's this kind of something that has been studied for a long time, always surprisingly. So people come up with various ideas. One thing I will say is that another aspect that is quite different in northern and southern states is gender relations. Maybe due to very historical ways of doing agriculture, with more emphasis on rice that has more place for women rather than wheat, which is plow based and has more space for men, and that is interesting and important in and of itself, and may also have something to do with all of the human capital development that is different in the northern state and the southern states as well, is when you have a bit more even gender relations that also affects how girls are faring, how boys are faring, and in turn I think the entire economy. So those are various things that people have floated along the lines, which are probably, I think, all play a role.
So your work has been so prolific in India, and so has been the work of your colleagues and like-minded researchers. I wonder if there was one big unanswered question about poverty in India that you could answer, what would you pick? More broadly, perhaps, what do you think researchers on poverty in India should be focusing on now? And on the other side of this line, if policymakers want to make a serious dent in poverty over the next decade, what should they be prioritizing?
So again, I think it's not I've made a productive career saying that there are no magic bullet, and there is not one thing that one has to do and that is going to solve the entire problem or make an entire dent. It's not one magic bullet, it's many silver pellets. So I almost never think, oh, there is this one big question. If only we could answer it, we would be done. I think there are many questions that are of interest and remain to be asked. So I list a few. I think we already discussed this impact, the restructuration of social protection budgets and what's the best way to go about it, the impact on this cash benefit transfer and targeting and so on. I think that's a big topic. Another one is education at the middle school level. I think we now have a good understanding of what needs to be done in primary school. And in fact, not only we have an understanding of what needs to be done, it's starting to get done. And we are, in fact, for the first time in the ASERS release this year, see a really significant improvement in reading and arithmetic at the primary level, which is, amazing news. But the next interesting question is what's happening next? What's happening now that the kids, learn to read in primary school and they go to middle school and high school? I don't think we have a lot of ideas about how to teach properly at those levels, and I think the needs are huge because it might be that the level is even worse than what we are seeing in primary school. For example, in the ASER Beyond Basic survey that was done a few years ago, which target these middle school age kids, you have, almost 2/3 of the kids cannot answer the following questions. A particular kid went to bed at 8:30 and woke up at 6:30. How in the next morning? How much did she sleep? I might be wrong on the hours, but not on the structure of the question. 2/3 of the kids answer this question. We have a problem. We really do. So I think the middle school level is really fascinating, and there is a big gap in research and also in policy, I think, at that level. Another set of really fascinating questions, and I think is the how India is going to withstand climate change. So what we can do for mitigation, what we can do for adaptation. Maybe we'll go back to that a little later. Another one is women participation in the labor market. India is now probably the country with the lowest female labor force participation in the world, much lower than Saudi Arabia. As the country becomes richer, if it's lowering, it seems that, if we want to, I'm including myself in we as India, as an honorary Indian, so to speak, if the country wants to keep its advantage, it wants to keep its kind of playing the maximum into its demographic dividend and keep getting the great economy it can be, it needs to find a way to involve women. So that's a big topic. So you wanted one, I give you a few.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, that women labor participation ratio figure is so shocking, and it's been steadily dropping. And you're right. I mean, we are three women talking about India's problems. This really needs to be highlighted. I don't think people appreciate how significant this is enough. You've mentioned climate change already, Esther. Let's just follow that up. Do you see climate change undoing decades of poverty reduction especially in developing countries?
There is a huge danger of that, and in particular in India, because some parts of India, in particular the north of India, with this very continental, already hot places, are going to become already largely unlivable in part of the summer. And so India is really one of the countries which is absolutely in the bull's eyes in terms of the impact of climate change and the impact of climate change on the poor in India in particular. So I think it could have dramatic impact. It already does. I think it's something we should not talk about in the future. It's already happening. We saw it last summer 1 year ago with this incredible heat wave and thousands of people dying simply because of the heat. And that's not going to improve in years to come, even if policy action suddenly materialize at the international level, because some of the damage is already done. So I think India is a pretty unique position in the world, that it's one of the countries that has margin for actions and immediate benefits on its own population. Because for most of the countries that would benefit the most from reducing climate change are countries that have nothing they can do because they already are emitting nothing, like poor countries in Africa. But India has a lot of people who are going to really be hurt by climate change, and it also has a lot of things it can do in terms of reducing emissions. So my hope is really in years to come, India is going to emerge as kind of the one country that is going to take this problem super seriously. Even though, I do recognize the unfairness of the fact that India has contributed nothing to the problem historically. Fortunately, it's still in the advantage of India now to think about what they can do about it in the future, both because of heat, but also because of the immediate impact of pollution, which are it's the same thing that produced the air pollution that is killing people left and right, and that is producing the cloud that is making the planet hotter. So a huge amount of work to do there. And I was just in the Sundarban for a few days just before we met in January in Jaipur, and this place is just suffering, reeling so much from the impact of climate change. And similarly, in Uttar Pradesh or in places in Punjab when it's become unbearably hot, these are different issues, but all related to climate change. That there need to be a huge amount of focus on helping people adapt, and social protection, again, as we were discussing, is going to play a key role there.
While I was to prepare for this conversation, as I was revisiting a lot of your papers, a lot of your writings and interviews, and there were a couple of things that really struck me. And there's this place in which you say that, I think it was an interview in Le Monde, where you say that economists have dangerous power. And in another very interesting paper that I absolutely love, you liken the work of an economist to that of a plumber. Then there's an unlikely paper by you in which you write about practices and choices when it comes to marriage and caste. And I say unlikely because that's the kind of work you would usually associate with an anthropologist rather than an economist. In the context of these things that I picked out and felt were so interesting to me, I wonder how you see the field of economics evolving, how you see the role of the economist evolving, and her purview of inquiry.
Yes, absolutely. So my my first encounter with economists really in action, as I was saying in the beginning of the interview, was in Russia. And this is where I saw how dangerous economists can be, because if they are listened to, they can really influence the course of history, which they did in Russia. For example, it's really economists from Harvard who suggested that the entire economy should be privatized on the basis of voucher-based privatization. It was a massive experiment. But it's not that they had, evidence. They thought it might work out. And so that is an example of, how economists can be dangerous. How can they be less dangerous? Well, is making sure that their policy prescriptions are based on scientific evidence, and that's easier to do. And another way in which they can be less dangerous is if they see their role less as kind of prescribing or advising on the big direction that governments can take, and more on these plumbing issues that you were talking about, which is, okay, a government wants to do something anyways. That's their priority. That's what the public wants, politician wants, presumably hopefully reflecting the will of the public via the democratic process. How to do that better? So in other words, I don't see my world as saying, government, you really need to focus on, say, middle school education, even though I think it's an important problem personally, but I'm never going to go to a government and say, hey, you should focus on middle school. But on the other hand, if a government comes to me and say, oh, we would really like to do something about middle school, what has people done, what has worked, what has not worked, etc. So, and even then, getting into really the details about how to make things work. It's not enough to say, well, with your middle school, you need to focus on teaching math. It's like once you've said that, it's like, who is going to teach math? How you're going to recruit the teachers, how they're going to be paid, how they're going to be incentivized, and so on and so forth. Those are all the plumbing questions. So that's where economists tend to be useful. Maybe by accident we became useful at that because we started working on all of these details. We became kind of good at running trains on time. And that's useful and I think not dangerous. With respect to the whole field, I think economics is a field that is much, much more diverse than most people think. Most people, when they think about it, try to conjure an economic in their mind, they think of someone wearing a suit and a tie and pronouncing about inflation or monetary theory. Well, in fact, economists do all sorts of stuff, including, studying who gets married to whom and what. And I like that about the field, that it's so diverse in terms of the question it asks, as well as the method it mobilizes.
So, Esther, we're very aware that you also are a professor. You have a student seminar you don't want to be late for, so we don't want to keep you. But as we wrap this up, I want to ask you two quick questions. One is, in what you've just been saying, are there other kinds? Do you think RCT is the only reliable form of evidence that economists can use? And more broadly, how has your work been affected? How has the Nobel Prize changed things for you? What has it allowed you to do? Give us a sense of that.
So on the first question, it's a very powerful tool. And what we are discovering now is that, it's much more democratized. A lot of people can use it. And therefore, there are a lot of questions we can now ask using randomized controlled trials. But there are also a lot that we cannot. For example, long-term impact of historical events or institutional change or most macro questions cannot be asked with randomized controlled trials. And for those, we have other tools. But the nice thing is that of the movement of randomized controlled trials, that it forces other methods to measure themselves against what we would be able to do if only we had a randomized controlled trial, and therefore to be more serious about what they consider to be allowable evidence. In other words, it's not because we cannot do a trial that we shouldn't be serious about the type of evidence we are marshalling and how we interpret it. And I think this has really kind of have had a good effect across the entire field on being more serious about what constitutes good evidence. But of course, the methods are very multiple and variable. Go to that marriage paper is not a randomized controlled trial. It's using data. Or I did a recent paper on kids in markets, which is entirely descriptive, where I showed that we showed with many co-authors that we interviewed kids in markets, we bought vegetables from them, and it's a purely descriptive fact that they are very good at math, but they cannot do school math. There is no randomized controlled trial, and yet it works. It's helpful. To conclude on the Nobel Prize, Seamus Heaney compared it as an avalanche, a benign avalanche, and changes everything along its path. So there was a bit of that, but fortunately or unfortunately, COVID followed quickly on the heels of it. So I didn't have much time going on the traveling circus that would usually follow the Nobel Prize. And now, I find it that it's a good megaphone for relaying my concern, my attempt to help the lives of the poorest, and I try to use it in this way.
Thank you, Esther, for your time and for your valuable insights. And to our audience, thank you very much for listening. If you like this episode, please remember to like, to share, to subscribe, to spread the word about this podcast. It's independently produced, and your support means a lot to us. Thank you very much again. And until next time, goodbye.